When people respond differently to the same fiscal policy measure, one wonders why different responses to the same policy. This you can appreciate if you consider that different people have different perception about the aggregate supply curve of the economy. Specifically, different people have different perception about what is the potential growth rate of the economy and what is an acceptable level of inflation for the economy. Suppose we have three individuals, A and B and C, whereas A thinks that the economy's potential growth rate is 6% because this person is drawing his inference about the potential growth rate looking at the last 2 years growth performance, whereas somebody who looks into last 10 years growth performance is thinking that 8% is the trend growth rate because that was the average growth rate that was achieved in the last 10 years. And person C who thinks that the 10% is the potential growth rate because he is comparing India's absolute level of GDP with the absolute level of GDP of developed economies like that of US. And if uh, if US economy grows by 1%, in that would amount to an additional output uh, which will be achieved in India if India grows at 7% given its level of GDP. So because India's absolute level of GDP is very low, person C feels that the economy's growth rate is much higher. It's around 10% because the economy has a lot of underutilized resources, and by giving a fiscal stimulus, many of those underutilized resources will be brought into use. Now, if you see uh, what is happening, if this was the different perceptions, I can say that this corresponds to a situation of, say, a natural rate of growth of 6%, okay, and this corresponds to a natural rate of growth of 8%, and this corresponds to a natural rate of growth of 10%. So this is AS1, AS2 and AS3. Now, if initially the economy's aggregate demand curve was like this, so the if you see the person who is thinking 6% is the rate of growth, to him the when the aggregate demand curve is at AD1, the economy is already operating at its trend rate of growth, and any further increase in aggregate demand will only lead to higher inflation without further gain to output, because we have already derived that what will be the impact of an expansionary fiscal policy. It will cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right to AD2. Now, the person who is thinking that 8% is the trend growth rate of the economy, for him initially, so for the let us first look at the first person's perception. His perception was price level was, say, P1, and increase in aggregate demand will only lead to higher inflation, whereas the person who is thinking that 8% is the trend growth rate, for him initially the price level was P3, and this expansionary fiscal policy is going to lead to a situation where price level will go up to P4. Whereas the person who is much ambitious and thinks 10% is the potential growth rate, for him, the economy is growing at a um, much at a growth rate which is much below its potential. It is growing, say, maybe around 7.5 to 8%. Now, by increasing the aggregate demand, the economy will achieve a relatively higher growth, say maybe around 9%, and in the process price level will go up, maybe say from say P5 to a level which is again equal to P3. So different people have, and another thing, we are finding that the price level goes up by different amounts depending on which AS curve we are looking at. Different people have different tolerance of inflation in the economy. So the person who is looking at the aggregate supply curve 1, he feels that the economy is operating on AS1. For him, the the tolerance level is already, the tolerance level has been achieved. But for the person who is expecting 8% growth rate, for him the economy is um, operating at a price point which is much below, and now with the increase in aggregate demand, price level will go up. There will be some inflation, but which is yet to be a area of concern. But for the person who is on AS3, for him the current price level, even though it is at say P5, the king occurs much after, and for him the tolerable level of inflation is somewhere around P1. Okay, so as different people have different perception about the trend growth rate, and as well as different perception about or different tolerance level for inflation, you are getting different responses to the same policy. Ultimately, the difference is arising as to what people feel as the true aggregate supply curve of the economy. Nobody knows what is the potential growth rate. Only we have estimates of the potential growth rate, and the estimate will vary depending on the methodology that is used. So if you think that the economy's potential growth rate is higher, and by giving a fiscal stimulus you will be able to move towards that, and you have a greater tolerance for inflation, perhaps you would welcome the policy move, whereas somebody who thinks that the economy's growth rate, potential growth rate is 6%, now increasing growth any further will not be materializing, only you will get higher inflation, he will be averse to this expansionary fiscal policy. And the person who is on AS2, for him, by shifting the aggregate demand, the economy's growth rate will move up from say 7.5% to somewhere around 8.5%, or towards 9%, or it is moving towards the 8%. Here we have shown it, so that you are getting higher growth, but also in the process you are getting higher inflation. So he says that this will work, but it will create its own problem. The problem is on the inflation front. So we have seen that we can not only discuss the impact of different policy measures on GDP and interest rate using the ISLM model. We can derive the aggregate demand curve from the ISLM model, and superimposing the aggregate supply curve on it, we can study what happens to the economy's price level or inflation and the GDP growth rate when monetary or fiscal stimulus is given to an economy. And this, please recall that we had presented not only the price level but the inflation rates also on this y-axis. Okay, because intertemporal effects we cannot show. Ideally it is a relationship between p and y, but I am representing the growth rates also on the x-axis and on the which is denoting Y. I am also representing growth in Y, and here I am not only representing P but also the growth in price level, which is inflation.